We are actually still waiting for one of our panelists to show up, and hopefully she can still join us. But I'll tell you what, it really, whether she makes it or not, we're going to have an awesome discussion today. So thank you so much for joining. Today's webinar is Healthcare on the Hill, SBOMs, the Executive Orders, and the Future of Software Security. My name is Alicia Bond, and I'm honored to be today's moderator, excuse me. With the new administration being in office for just over 50 days, there's already been a lot of changes. So I know our panelists are going to have a great discussion today. If time permits, we would love to take a few audience questions. So we have the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to enter any questions you may have. And if we have time, we will absolutely do our best to address them. If we run out of time, we will also do our best to follow up with an email to this entire group. So I'll tell you, I couldn't be more excited to be today's moderator and to be hosting this incredible panel of highly respected individuals with deep, deep knowledge and experience across the many, many facets that this discussion is going to go on. From regulatory, quality, government, policy, law, you name it. We've got experts on this panel who are going to share some interesting thoughts and share with us what's happening out there. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to provide a quick introduction and a little bit about your awesome backgrounds for our audience. So Tim, welcome. Would you mind getting us started?
Sure thing, Alicia. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Mackey. I am now on year 8 of being with Black Duck Software, where I have the gloriously, ridiculously long title of being Head of Software Supply Chain Risk Strategy, which, as you might expect from having a title that long, means that I get to put my fingers in a lot of pies that are related to legislative events, standards efforts, regulatory initiatives, regulator guidance and guidelines and best practices and so forth. For those of you who don't know Black Duck, we're in the application security business, and we actually just last October spun out from Synopsys, where we spent about 7 years-ish as part of Synopsys. Prior to that, I was 13 years at Citrix, where I had a mix of roles, including open source program office roles, as well as having dotted lines into our CSO. Very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Tim. We're thrilled to have you. Ralph, it's an honor to have you here with us as well. Would you mind providing us an introduction?
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you could join us. I'm a lawyer by training. Spent a lot of time in industry, both big pharma and device, was general counsel of a large medical device operation that was heavily software dependent. I've been in private practice. I've done a lot of work in DC in the FDA healthcare policy arena, working with Congress, FDA, private sector on healthcare FDA related matters. During this, I've also taught. I spent 18 years as professor of practice at the University of Minnesota, teaching at the law school and the business school, teaching FDA law, healthcare law, those kinds of subjects. Right now, I'm on my own and concentrating on FDA and healthcare policy matters in this rapidly changing and evolving DC world.
Awesome. Thank you, Ralph. And last but not least, we're thrilled to have Ken with us.
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks, Ralph and Tim, for being here. My name is Ken Zalevsky. I'm the CEO of Vigilant Ops. My background is medical technology. I come from Bayer, a large global medical device manufacturer, where I ran the medical device cybersecurity group there. As you can imagine, being at Bayer and being at a med device manufacturer with, all those globally deployed devices and that, threat vector or attack vector being as big as it is, constantly worrying about these issues was part of my daily routine. I launched Vigilant Ops really with the idea of bringing, advanced technology to bear with respect to these cybersecurity issues that I saw. So helping organizations navigate the complexities of cybersecurity, especially in areas where maybe a lot of advanced technology hasn't been deployed, is what we do at Vigilant Ops. If you don't know Vigilant Ops, we're an SBOM lifecycle management organization. We help automate that entire process from generation of SBOM all the way through to sharing and consuming SBOMs. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm also still very much aligned with FDA and CISA and other organizations, and watching and very closely monitoring what's happening around the world from a global regulations perspective. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion today. I think it's going to be a really interesting one. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, Ken. Our fourth panelist is Elizabeth George. If she lands, she's on a flight right now. If she's able to join us, she will, and she'll provide you with a brief introduction. I'll pause and allow her to do that. But she comes from the regulatory and quality space, and she's won many awards and has quite a bit of experience. So if she does join, we will have her do a quick introduction. But let's go ahead and get started on this very, very interesting topic. Well, as I mentioned, the new administration has been in office now for a bit, a little over 50 days actually, and the previous administration had issued executive orders and national security memorandums that were focused on software security, transparency, and accountability. With the new administration introducing kind of its own set of orders, how do these changes affect the momentum of software security initiatives and particularly SBOM adoption? Tim, I was wondering if you could get us started on this topic.
Sure. So I'm certain that everyone in the audience at this point has seen that there's a, let's call it almost a knee-jerk reaction that said, new administration, let's go and rescind a bunch of executive orders from the previous administration. Let's go put in place a bunch of executive orders that establish our perspective on the way things, quote, should be. One of the things that truly jumps out from a cybersecurity perspective is that Executive Order 14028, and by extension, Executive Order 14144, which are related to each other, they did not get rescinded. The cybersecurity principles and practices that were espoused as part of 14028 remain in place today. Organizations that had an obligation to go and file a CISA self-attestation form under 14028 still have that today. The associated OMB memos and GSA memos that enacted these requirements, they're all effectively in place today. What we have seen that is probably a signal to the rest of the cybersecurity community is a desire to not just rely on the regulator and the regulator's perspective on what good and bad and what should and shouldn't be done, but to draw line of sight back to statute and say that when CISA was created, this is what we expressed as the objectives for CISA. When this particular set of requirements under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act were put in place, this is what we see and what we expect. So from a pure SBOM perspective, there is no requirement that was part of 14028, so there probably is still no requirement and no direct set of requirements that are going to come out of that. We did see as part of regulatory action that Congress created Section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and it did include a requirement for an SBOM, and a fairly robust one at that. Since that's part of statute, based on every piece of tea leaf reading that I can do today, that is very likely to remain in place as we move forward. Similarly, all of the vulnerability disclosure requirements and so forth that are also part and parcel to 524B would be part of that landscape. Will we see changes to 14028 and some of its direction? Sure. I would be very surprised if there's not a tweak and tune that happens. But the reality is today, little has changed in terms of the priorities around SBOMs. The SBOM community is still very much active and doing good work there. So there's a lot that we can work with as we move forward. So kind of a long-winded answer, but needed to touch a bunch of points given that the complexity and velocity of executive orders is a little bit challenging some days.
That's great, Tim. And I think I would like to add a little bit to that. And I agree with Tim's viewpoint 100%. I mean, I'm seeing the same thing. I think that if you look at specifically, and you brought up 524B and the FD&C Act and FDA for the first time getting legislative authority to require not only SBOMs, but plans to monitor for vulnerabilities after devices are in the field. I don't think that's going to change either. I think we'll still see that moving forward. But to your point, I would be surprised if there weren't some tweaks to 14028. One of the things that I see and I feel a lot pretty confident going forward. I think that the Trump administration seems to be focused a lot on private-public partnerships and information sharing, taking kind of the bureaucracy out of it and kind of speeding things up, right? And I feel like with that in mind, I think the sharing of information from private to public and vice versa will be facilitated through some of this stuff. So I think 14028 did some of that already. There was some stuff in there, if folks recall, about this private-public partnerships and information sharing. And I think transparency, SBOMs are a big vehicle for transparent communication. So I think that all is supported by kind of by what I'm seeing. Again, it's reading the tea leaves, but I think it's I think that's kind of the direction we're heading. Yeah.
Any added thoughts, Ralph?
Just a couple of things. First of all, we do not have an FDA commissioner right now. We know who the nominee.
Ralph, you might want to just move a little closer again.
Can you hear me?
Little.
Can you hear me? I don't know what's going. Can you hear me?
Little better. Little better. Go ahead.
I hope this is coming through. I don't know what's going on with the technology. We don't have an FDA commissioner yet. We know who the nominee is. It's highly likely Dr. Mackey will be confirmed, but we don't have leadership at FDA. So right now, they're just keeping the trains hopefully going on schedule until they get a new commissioner. The other things we don't know, which I think will impact this, and I'll spend more time on this later, is we don't have budget numbers. How much will FDA have to spend? And we'll get to staffing issues in a second. But as we think about the public-private aspect, one of the things that I'm watching is, do we have the fiscal resources and the personnel resources to support public-private partnerships, collaborative communities, organizations like IMDRF, et cetera. So that's something just to watch, to understand the resource level and the priority that FDA will be able to put into those activities.
So then, Ralph, just a quick question about the IMDRF side of the equation. Do you see the harmonization efforts for next year being put at risk?
I think they're at risk, yes. Now, whether that's going to pan out, I don't know. And the reason I think maybe a risk is too strong. I think it's something we need to watch. Will they have the resources to support it? And that's dollar resources, but it's also personnel resources. As you do reductions in force, FDA is going to have to decide what are its core functions, where is it going to focus? And will that mean less personnel to work on an IMDRF, an MDIC, any of those? The other question, which I don't know the answer to, is Mackey's view on globalization, global harmonization. We've seen in other areas like withdrawing from WHO. Will we have the same commitment to global harmonization that we've seen in the past? And that to me is an open question. Last point, Often this comes about through recognized standards, where an ISO and AMI, somebody will come up with a standard. FDA often will participate, and then that will be recognized. I would not be surprised if there's greater scrutiny by the political side of the operations over those recognized standards. Right now, a new major guidance goes through OMB, OIRA, those organizations. Historically, recognized standards really haven't. So one of the things I'm watching is whether they start to change the process for recognizing international standards.
Interesting. Thank you. Very interesting. So during this current administration's first term, the policy was to remove 2 regulations for every new one that was introduced. In this term, it's reportedly 10 regulations that need to be removed for every new one that is introduced. What challenges does this regulatory rollback pose for software supply chain security and compliance?
Yeah, I think it poses a number of interesting questions and challenges. In part, we've gone from the 2 for 1 to the 10 for 1, as you point out. The other thing that's kind of buried in that announcement is the definition of what is a quote regulation. I'm a lawyer by training. If you use the word regulation, that has a specific technical meaning to me. However, in that order, they included things like guidance documents as quote regulations subject to the 10 for 1. That's a significant and important difference. There are a lot of open implementation questions. As all of us know, a number of regulations, or I'm going to use the word regulation now in the way that they used in the executive order, broader, including guidances, are actually deregulatory, where we're coming up with ways for more efficient compliance approaches, whatever it happens to be. And when you think in the device space, if I have a new technology and I go through a de novo, or there's some other reclassification, that is actually a regulation that pops up in 21 CFR. Do those count as, quote, regulations for which I have to get rid of 10 others? And we don't have answers to that. I've asked that question. We don't have answers to that. But I think this will have a couple of impacts. First, I think we will see a dramatic slowing, perhaps even cessation of new guidances, new regs. In part, they've got to do the 10 for 1. And as you think about the 10 for 1, and I'm assuming the Trump administration is going to enforce it. Okay, that's always a question, but I assume they will. In the first Trump administration, they basically satisfied the 2 for 1 by getting rid of a lot of the low-hanging fruit. The old guidance on buggy whips, whatever it happened to be, out of date, no one's paying attention. Those are gone. So we've gotten rid of some of the easy ones. So to do a 10 for 1 now, you're going to be cutting much deeper. And I think that's going to be a significant impediment to issuance of new regulations, guidances. So I think there'll be a significant slowing. The other thing to remember here is in a different executive order, regulations are supposed to have a net zero economic impact, zero or actually improving economic importance. That adds another layer of complexity. And remember that regs need to go through HHS, generally speaking, need to go through OMB, need to go through OIRA. So that adds additional complexity, and they will be looking at these in part for economic impact, in part for cost, in part for statutory authority, and in part for consistency with broader administration policies. So I see a significant decrease in new guidance documents. I think FDA will be looking for other tools to communicate with the regulated community. It can be, for example, warning letters, 483s as a tool. It can be meetings. If they participate in public-private partnerships, that is another tool. The other complexity here is that there are a number of user fee commitments from our 22 user fee cycle that include issuing guidances on subject X or Y, or that lead in that direction. And I think those are at risk at this point in time. The last thing I would anticipate, if they do a new reg, a new guidance, it will tend to be higher level, more directional as compared to more explicit in terms of you must do A, B, and C. And I think they may try to group what may have been 2 or 3 guidances into one guidance. So those are just some thoughts. I'd like to know what Ken, Tim, others have to think about this very important question.
Yeah, I think that on the definition of regulation, anything that made its way into the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, no matter how convoluted the pathway to get there, I'm venturing that those are quote unquote safe because they required an act of Congress to get them to that point. Anything that falls under the umbrella of as the administrator sees fit and has that type of extra flowery language around it. So like the future cybersecurity guidance as part of 524B, that I think is probably a paused state. But to your point about guidance documents and standards participation, one possible future state from my perspective is that the regulatory control that FDA has, particularly at the device level, starts to be something that is more reflective of what is European with MDR than what FDA is leading with. And that if there is a desire in a future state to have a more, let's say, aggressive posture on a cybersecurity front, that may be a challenge for global manufacturers to go and say, wait a minute, our whole plan was around harmonization. We were trying to reduce the cost of doing business by having this baseline. Lo and behold, the US went and did things that muddied the water. We fell through with MDR, and now how are we being penalized? Is this market something that we want? Or we end up in a free-for-all market that is dominated by actors that we don't necessarily anticipate having a dominant position.
Yeah, yeah, that's great, Tim. Thanks, and thank you, Rob. I agree with both of you. I mean, I think that just to unpack that a little bit, and for folks who may or may not be familiar with the intricacies of regulations and guidances and things. I mean, if you look at historically, FDA has pretty much run device manufacturing on guidance documentation, right? And FDA has always had, prior to legislative authority, which we talked about before, and I'll mention in a second, always had this language that was kind of should or recommended. And so manufacturers kind of followed those guidance documents, and the penalty, of course, was not getting commercially approved or through the submission process if you didn't adhere to the guidance documentation. Now, with FDA, and Tim's point there, that last point you made about 524B, with the legislative authority, and that assuming not going anywhere, there's actual law in place. So the guidance, the pre-market guidance that recommends SBOM is now supported by legislative authority. So the SBOM and the monitoring and the planning and those things probably aren't going anywhere because they're legislatively mandated. To the point that both Ralph and Tim made, the guidance documents, who knows? I mean, they may be tweaked. Maybe some of them will be removed. But considering also the regional and global impact, and so Tim, you mentioned it there at the end. You think about a device manufacturer trying to satisfy commercial regulations globally. There's a lot of difficulty. We're not aligned right now. I mean, so if you look at FDA and FDA regulations and the SBOMs and things that we require here in the US to get through FDA submissions, right? They are differing across the world. I mean, there are regions that are requiring SBOMs, have been requiring. Health Canada has been requiring SBOMs for some time. If you look at Japan, they're requiring SBOMs. These areas, these regions the requirements are already there and they're continuing forward. A lot of it is based on FDA, but there's not global harmonization today. So we don't even have that today. I mean, I feel like Who knows if we're going to drift farther apart or get closer together. I'm on a couple of different trade associations and working groups that look globally across these regulations, and part of our goal is harmonization. What we want to try to do is really kind of alert folks and device manufacturers, specifically in the medtech space, what they need to do to satisfy regulations in various regions. I mean, I think most of the cue gets taken from FDA. So if you look around the world, the EU MDR and those kind of folks have implemented things that are similar to what we look at here in the US. But by and large, I'm not sure if the new administration is going to be better or worse for global harmonization. We'll see as we go forward. I feel like, as I said, folks need to keep an eye on what's happening in other regions and look at the adoption rates and how other organizations are adopting to the regulations around the world to kind of help them prepare and plan. So it's still a moving target in a lot of ways, but I agree with both of you. Thanks.
As you think about this, historically, people like me have concentrated on the federal level, right? What is FDA saying? I think that is now something we have to start to change our thinking. Yes, we have to pay attention to FDA, but I think Tim make the point, you also have to probably pay more attention, if you're global, to what's happening in the EU, Japan, Australia, whatever it happens to be, but also other governmental approaches and then also private sector. So what's the role of the state going to be here? And when you think about this from a privacy perspective, a lot of privacy is state law based. And so the states may start playing a bigger role here. And there you're going to see some variation. California may take a very different approach than Alabama, for example. Also, don't forget about non-FDA federal agencies, FTC, Securities and Exchange Commission are out there. And then what I'm watching is the role of the private sector in driving security, privacy, et cetera, by purchaser requirements, certification requirements. I'm a big hospital chain, for example. Well, I know what I need, and I will require as a contract matter X, Y, and Z. And you can see insurance companies starting to play a role in here, saying, I'll give you coverage and you'll get a better rate, hospital or physician or whatever the entity happens to be, if you have that kind of certification program or that type of oversight program in place. The last driver just to watch for is then the private litigation and the private liability front. My privacy is breached. Who cares what an FDA guidance is not, exists, doesn't exist? I may have a standalone cause of action. So I think we have to expand our horizon here to look at these broader sources of oversight with a particular emphasis. Like Tim, you made this point on how the private sector, the role of the private sector may well be increasing.
Yeah, and to add to that, the emphasis on the demand signal for richer, more robust cybersecurity is actually codified in some model language that the Health ISAC published a couple of years ago, specifically asking for software bills of materials and an understanding of what the inventory of software was within the particular piece of software being delivered. And they weren't looking at it from a device perspective per se. They were quite literally saying, well, if I've got medical record software, well, it too needs to be part of this, because if I, as a large HDO, aren't able to actually understand what I need to do from a patch and maintain, do I actually have proper ownership of the thing that I've just bought or licensed? And on the device side, of course, that gets a lot more complex when you start looking at the lifespan of some of these devices. So I completely agree that that demand signal piece may be one of the key, let's call it formative elements of what a future regulatory space looks like.
Yeah, and I wanted to comment on that as well, because I think Ralph brings up a great point there. We've been focusing a little bit, so it's kind of on the regulatory side and looking at that piece of it, but there's this consumer demand that is pulling, right? And historically, I've seen that demand follow a lot of what's happening in the federal space as well. I mean, I think the government sets an example, especially with FDA requiring SBOMs. I've seen hospitals reacting to that by requiring SBOMs. They've been doing it for some time. I think making those things actionable and making them useful to a hospital is kind of the next step. But I agree. The folks that are demanding this on the consumer side shouldn't be forgotten either. There's a big pull from that direction. So yeah, thank you. That's a great point.
Let me just build on that.
Oh, and Ralph, it looks like we're losing your audio again. I'm not sure you were so clear a minute ago. We completely lost you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's so much better. There you go.
I need my tech support, which is my grandson. Two other quick points to think about. And Ken made a very interesting point about how the consumer environment is expanding. And I think we need to start thinking beyond SBOM, including SBOM, but beyond SBOM. I may have home monitoring, healthcare monitoring equipment, right? I don't understand SBOMs. You can give me an SBOM, it's meaningless to me. How do we then go beyond SBOMs in security as we expand the user base into people like me who are not technology folks? So I think Ken made an important point there. And then Tim made another point I want to expand on, and that is your product life cycle. Usually is measured in years, correct? And from my world, we've got a midterm election coming up in 2 years. We have a presidential election coming up in 4 years. I don't know how those are going to turn out. I don't know how those may or may not change the approach of agencies to these kinds of issues. But from your compliance enforcement liability perspective, you are designing a software system today, this year, that may be in use for 5 years. And so I think we all need to avoid only looking at the short term, because the world is going to change. It always does.
Yeah, that consumability of security information, be it via an SBOM or any other mechanism, that's very much front and center of some European regulations that have absolutely nothing to do with a medical device space, but are illustrative of the type of problem that we're going to be contending with as we get more of these Internet of Things devices into our environment. It's all well and good to have an internet-enabled toaster and scratch your head as to what possible function it performs. But when you have something like a patient monitor system, and that monitor system is now determined to be vulnerable to something, but it is a connected device back to the management entity that is looking after that particular patient in a hospice scenario, now we start to get into the reality of that type of risk and that type of risk management.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And I believe, Tim, that's a great point that, healthcare, that's a part of the reason, healthcare is out ahead of the curve on a lot of this, because, the legacy device problem is fairly well known within healthcare, right? I mean, Ralph brought that up, that you have systems living beyond maybe the intended life cycle of the manufacturer. In healthcare, that's very true, and maybe even beyond what we think is even reasonable, that devices are being deployed for many years beyond the intended life cycle. And so you get into that issue of how do you support those? How do you patch, and what's the cybersecurity profile and risk of devices that maybe can't even be patched? I mean, they're running too old, their software's too old. I know IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, a couple of years back, released a document on legacy devices, again, working around that premise that you do the best you can as a manufacturer, but we know this legacy problem is there. And I think to Tim's point, it's healthcare is just the tip of the spear. I mean, as we see more IoT devices being deployed and massive communications across the network, then this, this legacy device or system problem becomes prevalent everywhere across verticals. So it's a good point and something to keep an eye on.
Let me give one example that I struggled with. I was general counsel of a company that made, among other products, pacemakers, implantable defibrillators, very, very software dependent, life or death, right? They had an implant life of 5 to 10 years, depending upon use and a number of different factors. So the software being developed today would still be functioning 8, 9 years out in life or death situations.
Mhm.
And so as you think about this thing, Ken is quite correct. You've got to take this long-term perspective.
Absolutely. Really good point. Yeah, and I know that's what FDA is looking at with end of life, end of support, all of these things. They have a critical eye on it for sure. Well, kind of sticking on the theme of regulatory for a moment. Reducing regulatory burdens is in many cases seen as a way to foster innovation, but it can also introduce potential security risks. So how should organizations navigate between, compliance and innovation in this rapidly changing landscape? Ken, do you mind getting us started on that one?
No, I'd be happy to, Alicia. So, that's a classic conundrum, right? I mean, you think about it, and think about, you want to get product out quickly and securely and safely, right? You want to get the product out there, but you want to put it through the security tests and make sure that is, the absolute most secure and safe product you can put out. And organizations need to strike that balance between compliance and, as you mentioned, their innovation. I mean, I think there are ways to do it. It's a challenge, of course. I mean, where do you put your resources? How do you best manage that? And especially in an area that we're in today with kind of so much uncertainty and things that are coming at us, if we just kind of stick with the basics and think about, security should be thought of upstream, as far upstream as possible. Thinking about design of a product. Now you should automatically, as an organization, be thinking about security when you're designing a product. I know 10 years ago that was probably unheard of, and maybe even today it's still a little unusual to adopt that frame, especially in med tech. But again, the idea, and FDA has said this many times, security shouldn't be a bolt on, right? It should be designed in. And I think that's one of the things that organizations can do is design this security in upstream to kind of maintain this security as you roll the products out, and it eases your compliance burden a little bit. So, I think with, you're not so far from the ideal state or where you need to be from a secure perspective. You're already thinking about the things that FDA would want you to think about and you want to think about as a secure organization. So it makes it a little bit easier to comply with the regulations. I mean, I think if you look at the regs and the requirements, I mean, nobody's asking anybody to do anything that we would all say is not a good idea anyway, right? I mean, we want to protect patients, especially in healthcare. We talk about protecting patients where lives matter, lives are at the other end of those devices. That's just kind of, I think everybody agrees it's a good idea. And so I think if you think about that from that perspective, and automation is a big piece of that. If you can look around and adopt a risk-based approach and some tools that help you to factor in various vulnerability analyses from various sources. There's lots of public information out there about vulnerabilities. There are various sources like KEV, and CIS has got their KEV database, known exploited vulnerabilities, that you can factor in when you're looking at risks. So the NVDs with their CVE, common vulnerability database that you can look at, prioritizing based on criticality there, help you prioritize those vulnerabilities and mitigate some of that security. But again, I think compliance is pretty reasonable. I think if you get out ahead of it, and the best way to do that is to automate as much of this as you can, automate a lot of the testing and things like that, I think you'll be in good shape. I'd love to hear I'll stop there and let Ralph and Tim chime in as well.
Yeah, so everything you said, thumbs up. I'll introduce a risk element. So as development teams move from more of a V model development into more of a agile DevOps, I can go and do anything. I should be able to press the stop button on a production line the moment that I understand there's a defect there. When it comes to a regulatory conversation, the developers aren't lawyers. If we start having developers trying to interpret regulation and trying to interpret legislation, no matter how well-intentioned they are going to miss the boat. And so for me, that means that there needs to be a continued collaborative relationship between the development teams and the regulatory teams to go and say, okay, what are we doing? What is the risk of this? What mitigations do we have in place? We want to be agile. We want to be more responsive. But to Ralph's point about pacemakers earlier, we do not want to have the ability for a developer to press a button in a CI/CD system that does a spontaneous deployment of a new piece of firmware to our Wi-Fi enabled pacemaker, where the device is going to go into a reboot cycle after the patch is applied. We do not want to have that happening anywhere. But if we just let the developers go and do what they would organically do, they're going to come up with the quick way of deploying this thing absent that contextual information.
Yeah, Tim, that's right on the money. And actually, if Elizabeth was here, she would tell you that one of the first webinars we did together was all about, throwing cybersecurity over the wall. It's this collaborative effort. You got it right there. I mean, functionally across an organization, cybersecurity just doesn't belong to the technical teams, right? It's pervasive across the organization. All the functions need to be involved. That's a fantastic point. Ralph, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah. Four things. First, your point about collaboration and involvement is absolutely critical. Going back into my general counsel days, it was if I knew of something, I could address it and prevent the problem. If I didn't know about it, I got surprised, and it cost us a lot more time, effort, money to fix. Let me make a couple other things. Think about innovation in terms of, is it value added innovation? Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Does it add value? Patient, consumer, healthcare system, whatever. I think this is implicit in what Ken and Tim talked about, but a risk assessment. So if I make this change, I need a structured, formal risk assessment. And to think about this in life cycle. What happens in a year, 5 years? Down the line, how does this fit into the broader healthcare ecosystem? I mean, look, you've all been in hospital rooms or know about hospital rooms. How does it fit into the broader ecosystem today and moving forward? So is it value added? What's your risk assessment? What's the life cycle? And who do I need to bring into the conversation up front?
And as part of that bringing into the conversation up front, one of the things that I've said for years, stood up in stages with thousands of people, if you're a techie, go find your legal team, make friends with them, hang out with them at lunch, be a person to them, because you as a techie are probably going to come down with an innovative solution to X, and it might run afoul of some regulation someplace. If you are a known human to the legal team, there's probably a conversation that happens as opposed to an email that says, why did you do this? We need to stop this right now. I don't care whether or not you think this is your baby and it's the most awesomest thing ever. We need to have a conversation in my office. That relationship has to be built and nurtured for the organization to succeed in a risk-adverse environment.
I love it. Yeah, we did have a webinar early on exactly on that topic. The replay's out there if anybody's interested, but I think you said it very succinctly. Yeah, engage early and often, right? Engineering, quality, regulatory, absolutely. Great points. So with all these evolving kind of executive actions and potential more regulatory changes, some might question if SBOM management is still as critical to software security as it was before. What are your thoughts on the role of SBOMs in ensuring safety and compliance amid these changes? Tim?
I see an SBOM as being a critical component to that. It's a measure of the type of risk and gives insight into the potential decision-making processes that the development teams put in place. If we go and we buy a new medical device for home personal use, that software bundle that's part of that device could easily be half, 3/4, 80, 90% from third-party sources. They might be open source, they might be commercial, but they're still third-party sources. Those sources probably do not know that their software, components, libraries, what have you, are actually in a medical device that is going to have an opinion on patient health. And so that means that you don't necessarily have that software tested to the specific requirements of the context that that device lives within. If I'm, for example, writing log4j, I don't know that it's in a heart monitor. I'm not testing it for stability in that type of environment. If I was in a commercial piece of software, I might even put a restriction in the license agreement that says if there's patient health or human health, sorry, no, I don't want this. This is not a risk that I'm willing to take. By having that SBOM, you can start to assess whether or not the decision-making and the risks that were deemed acceptable by whoever produced that component or that library are risks that you have to mitigate as a producer of a new device that is going to operate on patient health.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think the only thing that I would say about that, Alicia, I think it's succinctly and it kind of feels common sense-ish to me, but how would we feel about the food ingredients on the ingredients on a food package going away? That label, right? That's exactly what SBOMs do, right? They're the transparency, they're the component list of components in a device. I can't imagine anybody saying that's not a good idea. So I'm with Tim. I think the more transparency, the better.
Right, and the management aspect too.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. Any thoughts, Ralph, that you'd like to add? Oh, darn, your audio is in and out again. We're not hearing you at all now, just so you know. No, nothing yet. No. Tell you what, well, this,
Can you hear me?
yes, a little bit.
I don't know what's going on. I need an SBOM. Two thoughts. SBOMs, internal and external value. Remember both of them because they have differing but very complementary values. And secondly, don't just stop with an SBOM. There are other tools that we need to include, not in lieu of, but as you get into home use. And FDA, at least last year, had a big push into the home as the hospital. How do you deal with people like me in that? So remember the internal, external use, remember your consumer base.
Yeah, and that internal, external use becomes really, really important from my perspective, because while there might be some restrictions that legal teams might prefer to impose on information sharing that might restrict the contents of that external SBOM, within the organization, there should be no barriers to the detailed nature of whatever could be communicated via an SBOM. And so to go back to my earlier example, if I have a library, a team that just makes libraries, maybe it's an authentication library, maybe it's a data access library, doesn't matter. Their choice of testing and release criteria might be different than mine, because my device may have a more stringent set of requirements than my colleague's device across the building. Even though we work for the same employer, we're using the same libraries. I need to know that that team that produced the library went this far, and I need to take it further in order to meet my requirements. Transparency of what's happening within the organization should never be an impediment to using SBOMs and to actually building meaningful processes and workflows around the SBOM, let's call it life cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, you hit it there with the life cycle idea and the management of those SBOMs, Tim, to your point, sharing those internally is super critical. We always say that producers of technology at some point probably are also consumers of technology. They're, using components and building their products from them. So we all need to be aware, to your point, internally and externally. So a great point. Yeah, thank you for making it.
Awesome. So last question, Ralph, I'm going to pose this one to you to get us started, and hopefully we can hear your mic. Based on the current trends and policy decisions, where do you see the future of software security regulations heading? And how can businesses proactively prepare for these potential upcoming changes?
So first, can you hear me?
Yes, the best,
Okay.
really good.
All right. A couple of thoughts here. Security concerns are not going away. I don't care what the administration is. I don't care what elections happen. These issues of software security are here to stay. So don't get lulled into a false sense of security of, oh, this administration's more deregulatory. As we pointed out earlier, you need to look and be conversant with oversight systems beyond just FDA or US federal policy. State, private, purchasers, liability concerns, international, standard setting organizations. This is an ecosystem. And those other elements are still there. And frankly, I think they're becoming more important. And this administration has what appears to be a philosophical approach to move some things from a public sector to a private sector. That doesn't mean they're still not important. It's just where you're looking and who you're responding to changes a bit. We're in a period, and I have an intuitive grasp of the obvious sometimes, of tremendous change. We don't have an FDA commissioner. We're already there's a 4-step RIF process with the first deliverable internal being this Thursday. We're going to have budget cuts, et-cetera. We know the probable senior staffers going into FDA. I know several of them. A couple of them come from Congress where they worked on these issues. They were involved in 524B, right? They were on committees of jurisdiction. These people have an understanding of this area from a legislative perspective. This stuff is important to them. Also, a number of those senior people have connections back to Congress. So there's going to be some transparency of information back and forth on it. Don't forget private sector here, like your customer, your purchaser. The other thing to pay attention to is, believe it or not, we're getting close to starting the next user fee negotiation cycle. That is going to be a very different negotiation than we've had in the past because of the changes at FDA. And I don't know what it's going to look like yet. Nobody does. But that's something to pay attention to. So what do? Make sure you've got broad information access. You're not just in your own little silo. You've got to pay attention to the external world here. And that can be a variety of mechanisms. It's trade associations. It's talking to consultants. It's talking to customers. It's just reading what's going on. Pendulum swing. So when in doubt, do what's right. Follow best practices. This is a long-term game. And I don't mean to underestimate by saying game. It's a long-term process. So we need to think life cycle. We need to think long-term. I think Tim has emphasized the need for collaboration and cooperation internally. That is, I think, absolutely critical. But software security, privacy, it is not going away.
So, and I would build on that to say that liability is going to be a key element. We have new liability directives in Europe that take effect in, I think, next year, if I recall correctly. One of the ways that you can build a richer, stronger, more resilient ecosystem is through transparency and transparency within the business relationship. So if you've got a HDO who is doing some vendor selection for a new thing, whatever it is that they're going to adopt, maybe the right answer is taking the vendor that is the most transparent about their cybersecurity practices. having that vendor be part of the solution, which is a more resilient experience from a patient perspective, because I know I don't want to go and receive another letter in the mail that insert healthcare entity here is now giving me another 3 years worth of credit monitoring on top of the 6,000 years worth of credit monitoring that I already have. Just because this was a preventable thing, that having just a little bit more insight could have been that key, let's call it inflection point between breach versus not breach.
Yeah, excellent points made by both Ralph and Tim. And I think the only thing that I would add, and it's maybe a little, going back to the question of, what do we think the impact's going to be? And I think both Ralph and Tim said it. I don't think it's not going anywhere. Cybersecurity regulations, cybersecurity is something we all need. And I don't expect that to change very much. I mean, the administration may change, they may change their focus, but at the end of the day, we all still need to protect our systems and our endpoints and our medical devices. So one thing that didn't come up, and Tim and I were chatting about this a little bit earlier, but Sean Planky was nominated by President Trump to run CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And CISA, if most folks know, have a lot to do with the mandates that are out there today. They developed a lot of the regulations and requirements you see around cybersecurity. So Sean Planky served under President Trump in the past, and from what I hear, it's a good thing for cybersecurity. So another thing that makes me feel positive that cybersecurity is not going anywhere, especially at the levels that we've seen it.
Excellent. We are right at time. So I really want to thank our audience for participating and watching and joining us today, taking time out of your very busy schedules. And I really want to give a special thanks to each of our panelists, Tim, Ralph, Ken. Thank you so much for taking time out of your really busy days. We really appreciate your time and really appreciate the discussion. It looks like we got a few comments, great points to consider. I was going to say, I hope everyone got a lot out of it, as I did. And I hope you all have a beautiful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.